So, actually, I was just, as you were describing the earlier conferences and discussions, I thought it was so easy to look at traditional patterns of urbanism in India and their link to spirituality and well-being, because these were really diagrams that manifest those missions. So to be charged by looking at the contemporary condition is much harder, and it's actually exactly diametrically opposite to the kind of questions that you raised, because it's the centripetal versus centrifugal forces of urbanism, and I think you've shown us about this expansiveness in the landscape, which leads to all sorts of problems. And I'm going to sort of run to the other end of the spectrum, which is when you have an involution, when you have the densities and the lack of resources and the inequities, what are the responses? And for me, therefore, the notion of the temporal landscape begins to play an incredibly important role in what I sort of describe as, the contemporary phenomena in India, where in a city like Mumbai, for example, we added 1 million people a decade. And in a condition like that, planning just is reactive. It can't be speculative, it can't be projective. It can't even keep up with the pace of change. And so you get a kind of involuting kind of process, but you also get very, very sharp inequities in those societies, and therefore poverty and what that means and how does one deal with it, and how do you then situate spirituality or religion, well-being even, within that condition. And of course, different cultures perhaps in different situations, which is not to say all of Latin America is symbolized by this slide, but in different cultures you have extreme responses, in a sense, by society to those involuting kind of urban conditions. And in India, at least in Mumbai and the places I'm going to talk about, these are places of optimism, and they're places of production, they're places where hope sort of resides, and I think that is intrinsic as a condition when we talk about well-being and what people can sort of do. And it's interesting that, and I think this is important because one hears a lot of discussion about public and private space, places where people connect and where I think well-being really situates itself in collective sensibilities. And I think both in Latin America and in South Asia, many parts of Asia, I think what is unrecognized is that you have not only private space, public space, but you also have sacred space, because the presence of religion within the realm, I think, nuances public space. And I think this is a definition we have to. Yeah, and so what we're looking at here is a tree which has become a shrine, and there are many sort of occurrences of these. These are small places. They're temporary. Sometimes they last for a few years. It's sort of a constituency builds around it. And I think, again, these are about cultural differences, because the sanctity of a site is often considered to be more important than the building that really sits upon it. The building is regarded as, in our culture at least, as a continuously evolving artifact, not a static object. And J.B. Jackson, the renowned American landscape commentator and historian, was incredibly insightful, I believe, when he observed that any society that sees itself as a direct product of the cosmic plan is likely to celebrate the original circumstance of creation. Hinduism, even the Aboriginal people in Australia, they have the dream time. Or dreaming. And dreaming is a term used by the Aborigines to describe the relation and balance between the spiritual, natural, and the moral elements of the world. It's an English word, but its meaning goes beyond any suggestion of a spiritual or dream-related state. Rather, the dreaming relates to a period from the origin of the universe to a time before living memory or experience, a time of the creators, of ancestors, and supernatural beings. And so this sort of connection to this original moment of creation, and in Hinduism that also is really true, because then it allows a symbolic representation of that circumstance without necessarily resorting to its physical embodiment in buildings and the built environment in general. So here, for example, that piece of stone, it symbolizes the linga, or the phallus, which is really it's symbolic of that moment of creation. And other religions, for example, like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, assume that the true meaning of existence derives not from the beginning of the world, but from some extraordinary event or revelation, from a covenant between man and the divinity. And such religions are not concerned with reproducing any cosmic symbolism, but in celebrating the circumstance of that covenant through the building. And so the symbolism of the church, the mosque, is about celebrating that covenant. And I think this is a big difference, because the attitude in these different cultures to the marker of the sacred landscape is very different. In one, the sanctity of the landscape and place are essential and is continuous and not embodied by an object. In the other, the object of the place that represents a covenant is sacred. And it is this focus upon the object that renders a condition more static. So I just want to make this difference, because it allows, if you look at Hinduism, for example, and the way some of this plays out in the temporal landscape in India, this fundamental understanding in the way cultures and religions define the symbolism is very important, because it opens up many other ways that people can congregate within a temporal landscape for celebration, for community activities, for celebrating religion, sort of clarification, so to speak. And so in a place like Mumbai, the presence of objects, I mean, embedded in a tree, and sometimes used as a way to even purify. That's a public toilet which is in really bad shape, but by this sort of these symbols, it tends to become purified. Or this telephone box, which is now not operational, but it has a Ganesh on it and people actually worship it, it becomes a temple for a time. Or an old electric meter box which was abandoned has suddenly become a shrine, or mobile shrines for that example. So this presence is quite incredible. This is, I think, to me, this is the whitest wall in Mumbai, and this is the rich. And what they did was they converted it into a sacred space by slapping on the pantheon of Indian gods on these screen-printed tiles. So no one squats there, no one, puts political slogans on the wall, and it gets sort of sanctified and purified in a sense through that motion. And so, for example, in this tank, the temples around it are renovated by every generation to express their faith. But the water, with the pole in the center, which symbolizes the churning of the ocean, the original moment of creation, is the sacred space. And so when you have these kinds of densities, we were referring to open space and where people can congregate, and we talked about Olmsted. This is the reverse. So you can see the proportion of open space in Mumbai, and this is to scale with, say, look at it between London or even Tokyo is so much bigger than Mumbai. New York, of course, is sort of, Mumbai is no match. And that statistic for Mumbai includes the traffic circles, the green in the traffic circles on the road. So it's sort of a desperate calculation. And so this is an extreme condition in terms of amenities. As you were describing, in the American context, it's the other extreme. The expansiveness is almost out of control, and therefore the car is the only instrument of connection. And this is an example just to illustrate this, which, this is cricket and our public spaces. Cricket is, I describe it as a wonderful Indian game that the British invented. And it's very popular. But in the evenings, the space is used for weddings. And the pitch is sacred, so no one touches it. The wedding wraps around it. The kitchen serves samosas to the club members who are taking high tea, as well as to the wedding. This is a kind of synergistic relationship. And this is just bamboo, stick, and cloth. And by the morning, it disappears and it goes back to cricket. And so this sort of plays, this sort of expansion of urban space in this kind of condition of density and this sort of this creating of temporal landscapes to celebrate religion, congregation, etc., becomes an instrument by which people ensure their well-being in a sense. And so these are several festivals, and this one celebrates the birth of Lord Krishna on Janmashtami, and where human pyramids are sort of made in public space. Different congregations, the Muslim community, for example, uses the street to pray in the evenings on Fridays, because the mosque is too small for the amount of people that sort of live in these high densities, and the street itself becomes a venue for prayer, and it goes back to becoming a street. And so this sort of elasticity in the urban conditions allows this sort of to happen. Or tazia, where you have the creation of other structures which sort of begin to create a dialogue with the architecture, and these are mobile. They get burnt and they get immersed at the end of the procession. So there's no kind of memory that they leave. And of course, the greatest one that has emerged now in a place like Mumbai is that of Ganesh, the Ganesh celebrations, which occur for 10 days and involve between 5 and 7 million people every year. And of course, this is also counterpoint to architecture as being the sole instrument or spectacle of the city. And these festivals, which are temporal moments, really now begin to create these new forums through which the fantasies of subalterns are articulated, even organized sometimes into political action. And the popularity of this festival has become phenomenal. During the festival, which occurs from August or September, depending on the lunar calendar, different neighborhoods transform themselves temporarily to host this great idol, and new spaces are created, and this occurs at many levels. Sometimes just the joint family brings a small idol, the neighborhood brings larger idols, and these are much larger communities that get together, and in the last day there's the celebration in these processions. But it happens at every level. Like I said, this is a small family who have their individual idol, and they keep the idol for 3 days. They get together as a family, their meals, cousins come in from other parts of the country sometimes, and it's a really big moment. And then the idol is sort of immersed in the water on the 3rd day, the 2nd day, the 5th day, depending. But it also happens at the level of the city, where, for example, 1,500 idols at that scale were immersed that one day on the 10th day. And so it really actually engages the whole city, and it's always on in the water, the edges of the city, where this immersion happens, and it's really quite an amazing festival. And each procession sort of carries tableaus, and they sort of chant, and they sort of invite the god back the next year. Different processions vie against each other, different neighborhoods compete, but it's a real coming together of people. And then when on the 10th day, like I said, it gets immersed in the water, and the idol sort of dissolves, and immersion really becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city. And as the clay idol dissolves here in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode the spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted process, a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain the memory of the city. And so it's through these instruments that I think, which is a real counterpoint to what we were just discussing, that a city like this manages to expand its margins to accommodate this sort of aspiration for community construction through celebration, which I think is really linked to well-being and of course to religion and therefore spirituality in a very broad sense. And so this idea of this kind of abstract imagination that allows people this ability to situate a sense of the spiritual in the city, of course, takes on another dimension, because this imagination also occurs in the imagination of the sacred geography across the whole nation. And Diana Eck has written this wonderful book on India, Sacred Geography, where she's, of course, talked about all of this in great detail. So here I'm just going to share with you the project that was referred to, which is the Kumbh Mela project, which is a university project. And this is a festival. It's a Hindu religious festival that occurs every 12 years at the confluence of the Ganges and the Yamuna River in the city of Allahabad. And since its inception early in the first millennium, the Kumbh Mela has become the largest public gathering in the world, and it today draws about 30 or 40 or 50 million pilgrims, no one really knows, over the course of the approximate 55 auspicious days to bathe in the Sangam, or the confluence of the two rivers, and that's a sort of sacred spot. And the festival provides a forum for both individual and collective expression of faith, as pilgrims, religious teachers, followers of monastic orders, and outside visitors all converge at that one place, which is Allahabad, which you see down there. It is the largest Hindu congress in the world, and it's very interesting that there are thousands of sects that come there, and of course Diana Eck can talk to this with much more expertise than I can. But even the Buddhists come there, the Jains come there, the Dalai Lama comes there, because Buddhism and Jainism are seen as reform movements of Hinduism, so they sit within the larger umbrella. And the underlying structure of the Mela supports the creation of a temporary city to house its many pilgrims, and I'll just show you this in a second. This city is laid out on a grid, constructed and deconstructed within a matter of weeks. Within the grid, multiple aspects of contemporary urbanism come to be realized, including spatial zoning an electricity grid, food and water distribution, physical infrastructure, construction, mass vaccinations. I mean, it was interesting how you talked about that as an infrastructure, public gathering space, nighttime social events, etc. The ultimate goal of the pilgrims is to bathe at the convergence of the river. Even this act is organized into large processions where pilgrims are given specific times and opportunities to bathe based on their social status. When the festival is not in season, the ground on which the city sits is used for different types of agricultural production in the interim period. Like many pilgrimage events in India, the Kumbh Mela is anchored in Hindu mythology. It is a confluence of different Hindu traditions at the confluence of these two great rivers, and the third mythical Saraswati river, which is invisible or subterranean. It is widely believed that at 4 sacred sites, which is what that slide showed, Hardwar, Ujjain, Nasik, Amrit, or the nectar of immortality, fell from a pot, which is Kumbh in Hindi, that's why it's called the Kumbh Mela, carried by the goddess Mohini as she whisked it away heavenwards. And out of the grasp of the demons who tried to claim it, her fight and the following pursuit, it is said to have lasted 12 divine days, which is the equivalent of 12 human years. And therefore the Mela festival is celebrated every 12 years, staggered at each of the 4 sites in this cycle. So that's really just the background of it. But it's powerful in that it actually captures the imagination of so many million people across this entire sacred geography. So this sort of virtual imagination perhaps is a powerful instrument in ways that people can connect and in, I think, conditions which are now facing these inequities and these extreme forms of poverty, it becomes really powerful in the way it relates to some of the questions that we discussed earlier or the larger themes that you're looking at here. Deeply embedded in the Hindu belief is the idea of the physical and spiritual cleansing. The Kumbh Mela involves not only pilgrimage to the 4 sites of divine presence, but also collective bathing in the water of the rivers. For the pilgrims, bathing is the climax of the journey and the culmination of a process that is meditative and healing for the individual and motivating for the collective in religious terms. And it's believed that you're freed from rebirth if you bathe on one of the 5 sacred days at the confluence where this nectar sort of fell. So it's sort of very powerful, and that's what it sort of looks like. I'm just going to run you through this to share the project with you because I think these open up other discussions in the context of what you're trying to pursue here. So that is the confluence of the 2 rivers, and those are the sandy banks, and what you see there is Allahabad, which is the city.
Go back for a second, if you don't mind. So this already is populated.
This
right?
is popular. This is a Google image from 12 years ago.
Okay.
And it's about that. That's an overlay of the district of the Kumbh city on Boston. So that's how large the temporary city is, and that's an overlay in scale of Manhattan. So that's how large it is. But the densities are higher because at any given time, 5 million people live here, and on the bathing dates, between 10 and 30 extra million people come in just for 24 hours. So the flux of the city is absolutely mind-boggling. And so from a public health perspective, etc., they were very, very interesting issues. But it's also interesting when you compare it to many other temporal landscapes like Burning Man or Kabul and the refugee camps in the periphery of Kabul. And of course, Hajj is very specific in the way that city is set up and I think close. But also Dabad in Kenya, for example, is a refugee camp that's been around for 22 years now. So what's up? And these are, actually it's interesting to compare these because what is not recognized in it is precisely what you're discussing as part of this series, is these become an aggregation of singular units, and there is in fact a very deliberate attempt not to allow the formation of community as a way of dissipating identity, which is very clear. Whereas this is very critical for well-being, that you can create a sense of community, and I think learning from the Kumbh Mela and its articulation was very interesting. And that's a Google image of this year's Kumbh Mela, which we got quite recently. And the river, of course, is different. And what's very interesting is that it's on a grid, and every road in the grid is extended through a pontoon bridge and makes the grid very robust. Unlike other cities, even Manhattan, where it comes down to 3 bridges or 4 bridges, but here the grid extends completely across. And so it's really robust as a system. And of course, it's on this temporal scale. It has these fluxes of 30 million pilgrims, and it's really the bath that is very important, which is the spectacle that has often been celebrated. And so our intention as part of the university project was to dig deeper to see what else we might find. And so we categorized it through urbanism, business, religion, technology, health, governance, and engineering, and did workshops for 6 months before going to discern the questions. But again, we felt, even within the question of well-being, as you're trying to define here, that we have to look at all these domains simultaneously. But separating any one of these domains is not a productive exercise. And so that's what's very interesting in the way even these seminars have been sort of structured. So religion, of course, was one. Urbanism, what is the disposition of the infrastructure? Business, there's a lot of vending and business that sort of emanates from it. One of the undergrads here at the college just studied flowers at the Kumbh Mela. That was her project, how the flowers moved around, where they came from, etc. Wonderful project. And of course technology, and we are now talking to cell phone companies through the business school to get aggregate data, because if we can actually tell where people came from, how long they stayed, it would be quite an interesting data set. And then health was very critical, because the susceptibility for outbreaks on all sorts of epidemics is incredible here, and water quality too, and governance, and how sort of people run an operation like this, and engineering, the construction of material. And so these domains, we came together through these different schools, which was really interesting, again, in a way that you begin to address all these domains through these different disciplines, which is interesting. And so that is an image I took in July, when the river was really full, and from that same spot, we took this image when we arrived there the first night. It's exactly the same spot, and you see the whole city unfold at your feet, and you see the scale. And these are before and afters of the same spot, and what we were not allowed to use aerial photography because of security reasons, so what we did was mounted cameras on kites and flew kites from 12 fixed points. So we have many pictures through the whole year, every month, with the river receding, mapping this sort of mechanics. So these are all before and after from the same spot. So you see the extent of it. It's just, and then of course these are details of each quarter, because they're principles by which communities organize themselves. This is the grid going across that I said. And these are the pontoon bridges that sort of construct this city, and it's till your eye can sort of go. It's just 20 kilometers in length and about 5 kilometers wide. It's got its suburbs and all of that, and it grows in those 55 days to get more and more complex. It's based on these sectors, so there's a whole planning kind of a set of principles used there. But essentially what we focused on was governance structures of power, potential of the grid infrastructure layers from the design school, and of course every school. And it has social infrastructure like these auditoriums and theaters and places of congregation for meetings. Minstrels sort of go through, singing through the city from different communities. There are community kitchens. You can walk into any one of these settlements and people will feed you free of charge. And people sell these little earthen stoves with a twig of wood. And so it's sort of this, and people carry a little bag like that. That's all they carry. It was the cleanest Indian city I've ever been to. There were no frills. No one had candy wrappers. Very frugal. It's an amazing demonstration of how lightly one can actually touch the ground and exist. And people do that in retreat for 55 days. Community kitchens. And then when sites are allocated to different sects and communities, there's a whole ritual of sanctifying the site. And there are rituals that follow in terms of the quarters are made. This man is sort of creating the segments, and each community has different beliefs of how that quarter is articulated, measured, and then the infrastructure set up. Every tent has electricity, water supply, or every community has water supply, but every tent has electricity and sewage. And it's a whole city that pops up. But it's essentially about religion. It's about people coming together. It's deeply spiritual in the discourses that sort of occur there. And what's mind-boggling is that it engages 50 million people, if you count everyone who comes in and out of there, so deeply in terms of their engagement with the different discourses that occur there. And again, these are all, the greatest, the best-known Hindu leaders from all over the place who all congregate. And then it leaves very little in terms of its footprint. What's left here are the coir mats, the thatch mats on which people were sleeping in the tents. And when the tents were removed, the mats just remain as a memory. But it also leaves, in some parts, an aftermath of sewage like this, which has become a big issue for the government. But what's interesting is that as it deconstructs, it goes back into agriculture for 3 months. So it goes back to agriculture from March, April, May. And then in June, on the same landscape comes the monsoon, and the river becomes really violent, and it completely wipes any memory of what was a place of occupation by 5 million people. And the river then flows for another 6 or 7 months before it recedes to make that land occupiable again. And so I think this sort of, I'm just sort of using these two examples that in different cultures, perhaps with very few resources, and I think this stems also from the religious sort of underpinning beliefs that you can use, or that they use these landscapes or these temporal landscapes in these incredibly elastic ways to accommodate not only ways of communities getting together, celebrating, but also celebrating through religion and embedding spirituality in those landscapes, which otherwise don't rely on physical infrastructure necessarily. So I thought that would be a useful interjection. Thank you.
Thanks.